So we'll turn this on, and we're going to be taking a look at Acts chapter 17. Those of you that have got a Bible, if you don't have a Bible, just grab one from nearby. But we're eventually going to confiscate those, and we're going to have to make you bring your own. Okay? So it's Acts chapter 17, verse 16 to 34. And the reason why I wanted to just bring this message today is because we're going through a number of gospel messages, and Paul is preaching. So I want to just plunge straight into the chapter. In verse 16 it says, "Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry." Now I'm reading from the King James Version. Just don't, if you've got a different one, don't worry about it. It's fine. They're all the same, or at least they're all very similar. The wording is very, very similar indeed. So Paul waited for them. Who's he waiting for? He's waiting for Timothy, he's waiting for Silas, and he's waiting for Luke to catch up. So how do we know that? Because when Paul was in Philippi, he had to run away quickly. He wasn't running away because he was afraid. He was running away because he had a lot to do, and also because the new church that he'd founded there were doing fine. And he left some of the people there to look after the Christians. He then went to Berea, and then he went to Thessalonica, then to Berea, then he went on to Athens. And in each of these places, the last place in Berea, he'd been run out of town. Not a good experience. And so he goes off to Athens. He walks all the way to Athens, a long way. And when he gets there, he's by himself. And he's feeling down. After all, it's not very easy when you've been run out of town, is it? I don't suppose. So he gets there, and his spirit is down, but the city makes him even more down. Let's have a think about why. Now, Athens was built on a white limestone hill. And we can go there today and we can marvel at all the architecture and the science and the religion. It was the birthplace, really, of culture and mathematics and a lot of other subjects, philosophy. It was a cluttered city of temples and shrines built into the hills. Someone has said that Athens had over 20,000 statues to their gods. See, they were very superstitious, you could say religious, and yet, by the way, Emily, I can't quite see you there. Come a bit closer so I can. Oh, it's you! Come on, take a seat. That's it. It was a city that was steeped in idolatry, absolutely steeped in it. And Paul's spiritual reaction on seeing Athens was not wonder, as we would do and get our camera out, take pictures. Well, he didn't have a camera. But anyway, no, Paul was disgusted by the city. He was disgusted and he was horrified by the nakedness, by the overt sexuality of it all, and by the grotesque gods of the Greeks. Okay, they were megalomaniacs, the gods of the Greeks were. They were part of their imagination, but, it was a horrendous thing. And the Greeks under Roman rule worshipped a whole pantheon of gods, okay, depicting all the personification of all the worst vices that heathen minds could invent. Not a pleasant place to be spiritually. And so there were statues of naked men and naked women, and it completely astounds us today for its artistry skill. However, it appalled Paul, and it ought to appall us when we see something like that. This was a flagrant breaking of the second commandment, and it would have been a huge shock to Paul, although it's very possible that Paul had been there before in his unconverted days. In those days, people traveled a lot. It's very possible that Christ could have come to England, as the hymn says. Quite possible. People traveled. It probably would have gone to Llandudno, because that was a major centre in Britain in those days, where the Romans took away all the tin to make bronze. So there was a lot of travelling. And of course, the Roman world wasn't a very big place, just about as big as the Mediterranean, a little bit beyond. So they did travel quite a lot. But Athens was one of these places. It was, you could call it the filth and the offscouring of the world. That's what it was like. They gloried and they were very proud of what they should have been ashamed of. You could say that's a little bit like today, isn't it? Just, oh no, a little bit like today, you're telling me. You go to certain parts of the world on certain occasions, and I tell you what, it's not a great thing to be a Christian there. So verse 17 says, therefore he disputed in the synagogue. Now the synagogue is the place where the Jews were, so that's the place he went to first. He went to the synagogue with the devout persons. So devout person means somebody that was religious, but in the best sense. They were good, law-abiding Jews, but they weren't Christians. And so he went there, and it says disputed. The word disputed, it means they didn't have an argument. What it means is that the way of teaching amongst the Jews is to ask a question of various sides but answer it. And they would discuss together why that idea must be right, or why this idea must be wrong, and whether this idea might be right as well. And so there would be a general discussion. That's what Paul did. He disputed with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace, daily with those that met him. And you say, the marketplace? Well, the marketplace was a place called the Agora. Okay? It was a long covered mall. We're used to malls today, aren't we? But in those days, they only had one or two in the whole world. And this was one of them. And it was just shop after shop after shop after shop in big rows, covered from the elements, because it rained a lot there. And the sun was very hot there too. And everything was for sale. It was the mega store of Athens. And in this mega store of Athens, they didn't just meet there to shop. They went there to talk. You see, there's one thing that Greeks loved, and that's talking. My wife would be good there. She loves to talk. Actually, no, come on. I do as well. I go to the local coffee shop, and I meet all sorts of people, and I talk for hours sometimes. It's lovely when you can talk about life. Okay? And so it says in verse 18 that certain philosophers, the Epicureans, I'm so sorry that you read all these Greek words, the Epicureans and the Stoics encountered him. Let's think about who these people were. Now, the Epicureans was a school of teaching which included slaves and women, which was very unusual in those days. They were very enlightened, and they taught peace and quiet, and they taught a form of science, but it had no place for God. It was completely atheistic. So unlike the religion of Athens, they were separate to that. Paul went to speak to them too. He also went to speak to the Stoics. Now, the Stoics were a school of thought based on the Semitic languages and the Semitic people. So the Jews, for example. So they were very religious. They were not at all atheistic, and they believed in the eternal Lord of life. You'll meet them. You'll meet people. Your next door neighbor will talk about the eternal Lord of life. And what they mean is anything that's religious has got nothing to do with the real God. That's what it means. And so Paul went to talk to those people too. Okay? And verse 19, and they took him and brought him to the Areopagus. Okay, that's a good word. You've got a lot of good words here today. So the Areopagus was a place where the Greek philosophers sat and talked endlessly. Now, it sounds like they weren't doing anything that productive. I expect all their wives are saying, why aren't you back home doing something productive? But actually, what they were discussing was not just nothingness. They were discussing philosophy. And philosophy meant the thinking of man. That's what it is. It's the thinking of mankind. And they would go into law and religion and politics and all of that. And you know what it's like when a group of men get together and they start talking about politics. There's no end, is there? No end. I had a friend of mine many years ago. He said to me, when we come together, we mustn't talk about religion or politics. I said, listen, frankly, they're the only two things worth thinking about, especially the religion. And it says about them, it says, they said to him, may we know of this new doctrine. Now, the word doctrine there, don't be put off by that. The word doctrine just means teaching. They knew that it was new. They hadn't heard it before. This is why a person that's a doctor is a teacher of theology, because it's teaching from the Bible. He says, may we know of this new doctrine that you speak, for thou bringest certain strange things to our ears, and we would like to know thereof what these things mean. So they took him to the Mars Hill. Now, Mars Hill was a large area in the city where all the philosophers used to go, and there they would discuss things of life. Paul's going to now face an atheistic world. So here's an education for you. When you see an atheist or when you hear an atheist, this is what you say to them. We'll read on. It says, verse 21, it says, "For all the Athenians and the strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear of some new thing." Okay, so on Mars Hill, there's a large amphitheatre made of stone. You can get 400 people in there, all tiered, down to a central spot. And right down at the very bottom, there are 2 blocks of stone. One on this side and one on this side, and then there's a little space in the middle. And on this side would sit somebody who's going to advocate for some form of politics or some form of religion. And on the other one would be the opponent, and they would argue for the other. Paul would have stood in the middle, okay? And he came there to preach. He came there to teach them. So in verse 22, it says, "Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, 'Ye men of Athens,'" okay, "I perceive that in all things you're too superstitious." Just like today. I know a footballer, and he has a little routine when he puts his shoes on, and he has to put them on in a certain way and turn around 3 times and then click his heels, and then he has to do the other one and turn around 3 times, then click his heels again. Do you know what? It's all meaningless. Doesn't mean a thing. I can't walk under the ladder, or I can't, oh dear me, oh, a black cat has just crossed my path. He's just going home. It's tea time. There's nothing, no significance in this. And you Christians, you know, and whether you're a Christian or not, beware of superstition. It means nothing. And what the Athenians had done is this. They had a god for every god they could think of. And they thought of more than 20,000 of them. They were just figments of their imagination. But some bright spark decided he would have an altar there where you could put a sacrifice, a little drink offering or a little mini sacrifice, and it would be to the God that we don't know about. Because he might have forgotten one. So we're going to have a little place where we can worship the God that we don't know about. And that's where Paul starts. That's where he starts. He says, "I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.'" Right. He says, "Whom therefore you ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you." I'm going to tell you about the God that you've not met yet. I remember talking to an atheist one day, quite a while ago. Here's a little tip for you if you're a Christian and you meet an atheist. Say to him, "Do you know God?" And he'll say, I don't know God. I say, "Oh, well, that's okay. You've just not been introduced yet." And they'll look a bit quizzical and say, "What do you mean? You just haven't met him yet. You've never met God, have you?" "No." "Well, that's okay. Nothing wrong with that." I once said to him, I said to a man who was particularly stubborn, I said, "Do you know a person called John Pugh?" And he went, "No." I said, "So you're an atheist in relation to John Pugh. You just don't know. You've never met him yet." I said, "If for you to say there's no God is a bit wrong, really." I said, "Because my brother, John Pugh, he could be hiding anywhere in the world. He could be in Africa where he used to work, hiding under a tree, and you'd never met him yet. Okay? There's nothing wrong with the fact that you've never met him. For you to say there's no such person as John Pugh," I said, "that's quite arrogant, really, because you don't know him. You haven't met him yet." And he went, Oh. I said, "So really, forget about the atheist. You're an agnostic. What that means is you don't have knowledge. That's all. You just don't know about it. There's nothing wrong with that. But I'm now going to tell you about him." And this is what Paul says. "I'm going to tell you about the unknown God." Right. And what he does, he speaks about the Creator He speaks about the Creator, who's the judge of all men, and faced with vice and heathen worship, he calls upon the whole people of Athens to repent or to reconsider what they've been thinking about and what they've been doing. You know, Paul presented the gospel everywhere he went in a different way, but it was the same message. It was always about Jesus, or it was always about God, but the way in which he presented it was different in each place. In this particular place, and at this particular time, he's going to bring down the whole temples of atheism to nothing. And that takes a bit of work, and he's going to do it. He says, who you ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. Then he starts. This is his theology now. He says, the God, and he always calls him the God of heaven. When he's speaking to a person that's not a Jew, he always calls God the God of heaven. So the God of heaven that made the world and all things therein, right? Seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't dwell in a temple made with hands. First point, number one. God is omnipresent. You couldn't make a temple big enough for the real God of heaven, because the God of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in a box and he doesn't live in this temple. That was a big lesson. They never knew that. They never knew that God was the God that's all present. Do you know what? If you went to the moon, God is there. If you went to the farthest star, God is there. If you went to the Orion galaxy, God is there. God is everywhere. And let me tell you something. God is not very evenly spread out like a bit of butter on a piece of toast. So there's just a little bit of him everywhere. No, it's bigger than that. All of God is everywhere. Not just a little bit of him. I've got the Holy Spirit in my heart. And did you know, Harley? Did you know, Dee? I've got all of him in my heart. What have you got? Oh, you've got all of him too. Right, so that's how big he is. Right, he's huge. He is an amazing, amazing God. Then in verse 25, he says this. He says, neither is he worshipped by men's hands as though he needs anything. What he's saying is this. You can't feed God. You don't keep God going. He keeps you going. Oh, now this is a big change. Because in Athens, they brought all of their gifts, and they'd bring food, and they'd bring meat, and they'd bring drinks to their God. And the God, they thought, consumed them. And you had to keep doing it every day, because otherwise the God would die. And Paul is saying, no, the real God, the God of heaven, isn't worshipped by men's hands. Let me just say something to you. If you're a Christian, I'm going to say this, and you must understand this in the best light. God doesn't need you. Is that shocking? God doesn't need you, but you need him. You couldn't last a millisecond without him, but he doesn't need you. And he also says he doesn't need you, seeing he's the one who giveth to all life and breath and all things. So you don't exist to keep him going. He exists to keep you going. Wow. Now what this did in Athens, it just blew their minds. They couldn't cope with this. They couldn't cope. We'll see how they reacted in a bit. Okay, so he introduces the God of heaven. He's the creator. And now he says in verse 26, and he has made of one blood all nations of men to dwell upon the face of the earth. Let me just say something. We talk a lot about race. Talk a lot about race today. There is no such thing as race. There's only families. What does it mean to be British, to be white? No, we're all of one blood. I could have a transfusion from somebody that's of the same blood group as me, and it wouldn't matter one bit what colour they are. Because under that skin colour, there's no difference. But there are different families. And one of the things that we've discovered in recent years is this, is that in your family tree are all the races, no matter who you are. It comes as a bit of a shock that all English people, when they go back in their ancestry, they discover that most of them are French, because they came from Normandy. We were conquered by the French. And then when you go even further back, we were conquered by the Muslims. And when you go even further back, we were conquered by the Romans. And you go further back and it's the Babylonians, and further back it's the Persians, and it just goes on and on like that. Do you know, we've got a little bit of everybody inside us. This idea of race is completely hopeless. He has made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell upon the face of the earth. Now listen carefully to this. And he hath determined the bounds before appointed, the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation. You know what that really means? It means this. It means that God knows when you were born, he'll know when you die. He knows your birthday. Does that make you think? God knows my birthday. Wow. He doesn't just know my birthday. He knows every single hair on my head. As far as he's concerned, he knows how many they are. And he knows when I do that in the morning and one of them comes out. God knows all of these things. He knows absolutely everything. So he's the one who, he knows the time when that hair came out of your head. He knows the times before appointed, and he knows the bounds of their habitation. So he knows the number that's on your gate. He knows the limit of the territory in which you live. He understands the limit of this small island. He knows all these things. And he has determined them. He has set the boundaries. He set the times and he set the bounds that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him. What he's saying is this. He says, all of this that I'm telling you about God is so that you can search for him and then find him. That's the wonderful thing. God has done all of this so that you might search for him and find him. And he says, and he's not far from every one of us. In fact, he says, in him we live and move and have our being. You are not God. You're not God. You're not part of God. But God is part of you. And he's done all this so that you will have a search in your heart for him and you will get to know him. Okay? And then he quotes one of their own prophets. He says, and one of your prophets said the same. He says, one of your prophets said, we are also his offspring. And of course they are. You may not think this, but you are the offspring of God. You're not. You didn't come from evolution. You came from a God who made you. And he made you so perfectly and so amazingly that your body can be self-sustained. All you need is a bit of warmth, a bit of water, a bit of fuel, a bit of food, and you can go on for years and years and years, can't you? Because God has made you like that. And then he says in verse 29, for as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think of the Godhead like gold or silver or stone graven by art and man's devices. You're not, your life, first of all, your life does not consist of money. Your life does not consist of gold. Your life does not, well, we went to see a little baby yesterday. He's a tiny little mite, about as big, you can put him in your hand like that. That little baby, she hasn't got a bank account yet. She won't have money for a very, very long time. And when we finally lay her in her grave, as no doubt she will if the Lord doesn't come, she'll take none of it with her. Because it doesn't, look, you as a person have got nothing to do with gold and silver and precious stones. Nothing whatsoever. That's a bit of a shock, because the Athenians, they were very keen in wealth and very keen in health. Who was it who invented the Olympic Games? The Athenians. Of course they did. They believed in being strong, and they believed in running, and they believed in athletics. Of course, all of that passed away with the wars, and then we reinvented it just down the road in Much Wenlock, and we started the games all over again, and it became famous again. But the important thing is this: they only thought about this life. You talk to your neighbours, especially the ones that are young and fit like me, and say to them, what are you interested in? And they'll say, well, I'm interested in keeping fit. Quite right too. You've only got one body. You've got to keep it fit. That right, Harley? That's how Harley's managed to live so long, because he's fit and strong and works every day. Okay? But there's one thing that had never, ever popped into the mind of an Athenian ever, and that is that after they're dead, they could live again. Wow. You mean to say they could come back from the dead again? Yes. That's what we're talking about. That's what Paul's going to talk about now. So he says in verse 30, and the times of this ignorance God winked at. Now that's a funny expression. In those days, when you winked at something, it meant you forgive somebody. Okay? That's what it meant. And what he's saying is, all this period of time until you met me, God will forgive you of all of your ignorance. He'll forgive you about the fact that you don't know about the God of heaven. He'll forgive you about the fact that you don't know that God is all-knowing and all-present and all-wise and all-powerful. He'll forgive you of all of that. Right. But now, and that's the big thing, but now God commandeth all men everywhere to reconsider. To reconsider. To think again. It means to have a thought afterwards. It means to have an afterthought. I've lived half of my life in wickedness and debauchery and in drunkenness and in revelry. It's time to think again. It's time to reconsider, because I'm getting nearer and nearer to that end point. Okay? And when I get to the end point, my body is going to be buried. But then there's going to be another life. Do you know, one of the things that people don't realize is this. I talk to people about this quite a lot. It's quite an interesting way of talking to people. I say, did you know that you're going to live forever? And they say, nah, I don't believe that. I said, oh no, you're going to live forever. I know that you're going to die. But what's going to happen after you're dead is that God's going to come along and he's going to raise your body again. And you're going to live again. And you're going to live forever again. Forever and forever again. But the place where you live will be one of two destinations. It'll either be the lake of fire forever and ever, or it'll be forever in the presence of God. Now the question is this. What's the difference? The difference is a very stark thing. The difference is simply this, is that during your mortal life, you'll have an opportunity to hear the gospel. You'll be able to hear about Christ who loves you and died for you. You'll have an opportunity to accept him as your Savior. Now I know they'll say, what about the people in the jungle who had never heard of Jesus? Listen, everybody's heard of God. You go to the jungle and you won't have to teach them what's right and wrong. They know what's right and wrong. Why do they know? Because it's in their heart. They know what's right and wrong. You don't need to tell them, and you don't need to tell them about the God of heaven, because if you say to them, who do you worship when you make sacrifice? We worship the one that's up there. That's the God of heaven. They don't know very much about him, but they know he's there. And God will deal with those people on the basis of how they've lived. If they do what's wicked, he will judge them. If they do what's good, he will bless them. That's what God does with all people. But there is a third way. A third way. And this didn't really come out until the life of the Lord Jesus, and especially at his death. You see, God doesn't just bless those that are good and judge those that are bad. He does something else. He can take the people that are bad and bless them. You say, how can he do that? Is that a contradiction? No, it's not a contradiction. He's able to have grace and he's able to have mercy. Now, what's the difference between grace and mercy? Who's going to give me the definition for grace? It's the special kindness of God in which he gives his blessing to those who don't deserve it. Right? So what's mercy? It's the special kindness of God in which he withdraws his judgment from those who deserve his judgment. They're both beautiful things. One's negative and one's positive. And I love the grace one more than anything. But I'm aware that in his mercy, he withdraws his judgments from me. Wonderful. But in his grace, he bestows his blessings upon me, and I don't deserve one bit of it. And let me just say, if you're a Christian here, you're a dirty, filthy sinner under the judgment of God, and you don't deserve a single thing. And if you don't stand like that, he can't forgive you. You see, grace is the forgiveness of God to those who don't deserve it, and you don't deserve it. But you found Christ as your Savior. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing that nobody can take away from you. And so we go on. He says, the times of this ignorant God winked at, but now God commandeth all men everywhere to reconsider, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man that he hath ordained. Now, just a minute now. He says, God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world by a man? Yes. By the man that he has ordained, and he's given confidence to every single one of us by raising that man from the dead. Do you know, the amazing thing is, you tell people about this when you get home, the amazing thing is this, is that the one that died upon the cross of Calvary for our sin is the one that's going to be the judge of the world. And men will stand there and they'll say, who are you? And he'll say, well, I'm Jesus. And they'll say, oh, because the Lord Jesus said this. He says, the Father has committed all judgment to the Son. And no man or woman will ever be able to stand before him and say, you don't understand what I had to go through. And he'll say, well, tell me about it. Well, you don't understand the pain. You say, I'm afraid I had a lot of pain. Yeah, but you don't understand being rejected by your brethren. I was rejected by my brethren. Yeah, but you don't understand what it is to have privations. He said, well, I fasted for 40 days. I know what that's like. And everything that you could ever think of. And they'll say, well, but I was bereaved. I was hurt by bereavement. And he'll say, yes, and I stood at the grave of my friend and wept, even though I was going to raise him from the dead. Because the pain of that bereavement came to me. And he will understand everything that every man or woman ever has gone through. And yet he loved you and he died for you. And there'll be no excuses then. And he will have one question for them, I think. One question is this. Why did you reject me? That's what you would call spiritual insanity. As someone's in the sea and they're drowning and along comes the lifeboat and a hand comes down, I want to rescue you. And the person says, I don't want to be rescued. Can't help people who don't want to be rescued. Why did you reject me? Why did you say no to me? What was the reason? Was it your pride? You were a man and I don't need to be rescued. Listen, you need to get it into your head that when you need help, you get it. My wife said to me the other day, she said, oh, you haven't been to the doctor for a long time. I said, well, I'm well. I go to the doctor when I'm sick. And let me say something. If I'm sick or I'm not well, I'm the first to be knocking on that door. And you, every single one of you, you need to get to the point in which you might be a man, you might be big and strong, or you might have pride, but you need to humble yourself and say, Lord, I need help. I need you to save me. I need you to save me. And that's just what he will do. And what's it say in verse 32? It says, and when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. You see, you talk to your friends about the resurrection of the dead. You tell them that there's a life in the world to come. They'll laugh their head off because all they see is just this life. Nothing else. Nothing else. Remember the old bishop speaking to a young boy. He said to him one day, he said, so what do you want to do with your life? He said, I'm going to get married. He said, good. And what are you going to do then? He said, well, I'll have to have a job. And he said, good. And what will you do then? He said, we'll have children like we do. He said, yes, good. And what will you do then? He said, well, we'll see them grow up and leave. Okay, and what will you do then? He said, well, the dog will die. He said, yes. And then what will happen? He said, and then we'll die. He said, right. And then what will happen? And he said, oh, I haven't thought about that. It's time to think. It's time to reconsider. It's time to think about what God is doing and what God is speaking to you about. Some of them laughed. And some of them said, I'll have to think about this another day. So they put it off. How long did they put it off for? Probably they put it off forever. Do you know, I've discovered in my life that when you preach the gospel to somebody, they either respond or they just walk away and they never come back and say, can you explain it again? Weird, isn't it? Weird. And so Paul departed from among them. However, certain men clave unto him. That's the authorized version. That word clave, it's when you put a log next to the fire and you get your axe and you cut it like that and it claves into two. Except that the word has changed its meaning. We don't use the word clave like that anymore. What's the word clave mean, Harley? It means the opposite. See, this is why the authorized version sometimes isn't great. Because it's the opposite to that. It means to stick it together. That's what it means. So after you've cut your log in half, you put some glue on it and then you stick it together. He says certain people stuck to us. Certain people adhered themselves to us. That's what you are all here, your adherents. You're saying, I want to be stuck. That's what you're saying, Gloria. I want to be stuck here with these people. Because there's something good here. And the people, they came to Paul and they said, we want to be stuck to you because you're good. He says, and they believed. They stuck to Paul and they believed what he said. Beautiful. And among them was Dionysius the Areopagite and Damaris. Okay, Damaris and others will them. Do you know, this is a beautiful thing. When the gospel, when the good news of salvation comes to a person, when they say, I'm going to believe that, and I'm going to pray and ask God to save me like that, that's a wonderful thing. That's what we're praying for you to do. So let's just pray, shall we? Father, we thank